All right.
Well, we'll go ahead and get started. It's good to see you all. Welcome to the first lecture for the Arabic philosophy reading group. Today we have Nicholas Aubin presenting. Nicholas Aubin did his undergraduate here at Yale, after which he spent some time in Berlin, where he did his dissertation on power and possibility in early Arabic philosophy, where he was looking at figures like Ibn Suwad, Abu Hassan al-Amadi, and Abu Sahel al-Masihi. Currently, Nicholas is a postdoc at the University of Warwick, working on a project streamlining Galen. And this is a very interesting project. You should ask him about it afterwards. It's dealing a lot with Galenic summaries in Arabic and the reception of Galen in Islamic in general. And Nicholas, I don't have a mic, but I'll pass it on to you and let you introduce what you'll be talking about today.
Thank you, Michael, for that very warm introduction. And thank you all for coming, both the people in the room here today and the people all around the world. It means a lot to me that you're here. I am going to try my best to stay audible throughout this. I know that different levels of volume work for different kinds of events, but we're going to try our best today. So I'm not going to talk about any kind of streamlining Galen today, and I'm also not going to talk really about much that I covered in my dissertation, so don't feel bad if you haven't been reading up on all that. I'm actually going to talk about a very peculiar text, and the text that originally sparked my attention was a treatise by Avicenna, and it's a strange work within, even the strange works of Avicenna. This is kind of an anomaly. It's an early work of his, and there are two versions of the work. And my talk today is going to be trying to explore one hypothesis that I've recently had about why these two versions are so different and what this other version actually turns out to be. And the title of my talk, as you can see, is Two Sheikhs and a Long Tail. The two sheikhs are Jama'al-Din al-Qāsimī, he's on the right, and Ibn Sina. We don't have a good photograph of Ibn Sina, I think.
I know,
he was a little bit early for the age of photography. But we've got a nice stamp from the good old days there. So we're going to begin our long tale here, all the way back in around 1010 CE, and in the small village of Urganj, which is on the Turkmen-Uzbek border today. This is where Ibn Sina and other scholars were basically living the scholar's dream. They were well funded, they were well patronized, they could sort of write books in whatever topics they pleased, and they had a very energetic vizier in the court of the Khwarazm Shah Abu al-Abbas Ma'mun II, and he paid for all kinds of interesting books. We have quite a few of these works by Abu Sahel al-Masihi and others, and they range in various ways in different topics, but predominantly they tend to be works of what we think of as a sort of meta science, looking at science as an object of study. And we also see a concerted effort in natural philosophy and other things like logic. So this is where the story begins. And there's a little bit of drama, which, every good presentation has to have some drama. There's going to be a lot more drama later on in the presentation when we get to the Ottoman period, but this is sort of an interesting story that we find in the Chahar Maqala of Nizam al-Arudi. It's debatable whether we ought to put a lot of stock into the reports that he gives us, but it's a nice story anyway. We see Ibn Sina and his mentor and teacher, Abu Sahel al-Masihi, basically on the run from Mahmud of Ghazna, who is trying to attract these two and others to his court. And this is the story in which Ibn Sina makes it and Abu Sahel does not. Anyway, scholars, get caught up in all kinds of political intrigue as time goes by, and I thought that'd be a nice way to begin the story. It's also one of the more colorful slides that I have today for everybody. The rest are going to be mostly books. So it's in the context that I just outlined, the sort of scholarly circle that he was in, that this work on heavenly bodies sort of takes shape. And there are many ways we can assume it's an early work, but predominantly it seems that the tone, the content, the style, mark it out as an early text by Avicenna. And there are also parallels between this work and a work by his teacher, Abu Sahel al-Masihi, which also speaks to the sort of early phase of his career. So what is this book all about? We don't really talk about heavenly bodies much anymore in science, but basically when we say heavenly bodies, we mean the planets and the spheres that contain them. Now, back in the day, this was a geocentric model of the cosmos, of course, so we have the Earth in the middle, we have nested orbs containing spheres all around them, and one of the major themes of natural philosophy was trying to understand how this all worked and how it all fit together. This book doesn't just talk about those things, however. It talks more broadly about the sort of received view, the verified opinion that has sort of become concrete over the ages, going all the way back to the Greek fathers of philosophy. We're talking about Aristotle, we're talking about thinkers in his tradition. So in that sense, it's more of a book report almost. He's giving to his patron this sort of, here's what I've found after having done my research on the matter. Here's what the early thinkers have said, the al-Qāsimī, as he calls them. And this theme of tahqiq, of establishing the view and verifying it on your own, is also sort of running the current throughout the text. A major part of the work isn't really about heavenly bodies at all. It's about how one ought to approach the science of heavenly bodies and how various sciences fit together in this great picture of sciences. And in particular, the two sciences he's most concerned with are metaphysics, or divine science as he often calls it, and natural philosophy, physics. So what are the starting points, basically, of natural philosophy? What are the starting points of physics? When somebody sits down to write a book on physics, what can they assume? What's already been sort of laid out in metaphysics? And in that sense, and I'll say more about this later, it's primarily a work on the theme of usul. What are the foundations of this science? And he gives some of the usul. It's not as though you could read this book and understand all of natural philosophy, but he sort of gives, by way of example, the kinds of principles, of starting points that the metaphysicians have bequeathed to the natural philosopher. So, as I said, in this tradition of foundational principles, he's asking, what are these natural principles that we start with in natural philosophy? What kind of questions is it proper for the natural philosopher to ask versus the metaphysician? What kinds of questions are completely out of bounds for natural philosophy? And this is a theme. This is the first of two large side notes that I'm marking out in yellow here, so you don't have to pay a lot of attention to this if you don't want to, but just something that came up in my dissertation. There's strong similarities between this worry about what's proper to natural science here in this treatise on heavenly bodies by Avicenna, and in another work, the Pillars of the Universe, Kitab al-Kan al-Alam, by his teacher and mentor, Abu Sahel al-Masihi. I'm not going to really get into all the details of that today, but basically both of those works are worried about the kinds of questions Aristotle asks in his book on the heavens, the De Caelo, and particularly in book 2, where Aristotle starts wondering, why does the world rotate this way as opposed to that way? Basically, the theory is that these are not the questions that a natural philosopher should be asking. So that's enough about the text itself. Now we're going to talk about the printing of the text and the problem that occasioned this whole talk today. So there's two printings of a text by Avicenna on heavenly bodies. One's called On Heavenly Bodies, the Al-Ajram al-Uqliyya, and it's printed in the Tisa Rasail, the 9 treatises, in Cairo, 1908. And then there's another, which Dimitri Gutas has identified as a very related work, the Bayan al-Jawhar al-Nafis, which is in a different Majmu'ah, a different collection, the Majmu'ah of Rasail in 1910, also published in Cairo. And not only are the titles different, the texts themselves are rather different, as we'll explore in more detail. So there's a question whether these are two different recensions of the same work or two different texts altogether. I'm going to say a few things about the so-called standard version, the version that agrees with the most manuscripts. I have to say with a caveat that I've not been able to inspect all the manuscripts. There are many, many of them. I think you've identified somewhere up like 29 or 30 manuscripts. And the two that I've been able to inspect are in agreement with the printing that we see in the standard version. So this other side. As far as I know, no manuscript that we are aware of agrees with the Bayan al-Jawhar al-Nafis, which is this other version. So how different are these two versions? And this is where it's a real honor to have the great Sheikh here himself, so we can discuss 3 Sheikhs in a long time. So building off of the very important work done by Dimitri Gutas with regards to this treatise, back in 1910, he publishes in part of a larger article the first couple sections of these works, the very opening paragraphs, and shows just how different they are. He thinks that these are two different recensions. Maybe he doesn't think that anymore. But back in 2010, he says they may be two different recensions by Avicenna, and observes that the Bayan al-Jawhar an-Nafis, so this 1910 version in the Majmu'ah, is the more concise and straightforward version. He suggests that the Bayan may be an earlier version, so a younger attempt by Avicenna. But he marks out that this is a preliminary assessment, based only on these really first paragraphs of the text, and this appraisal is based predominantly on stylistic considerations, terminological irregularities, for instance, the use of kiyan as opposed to tabi'a, talk about nature. And he calls for the theory to be tested by comparing both versions of this text to the mature works of Avicenna, particularly the Shifa. And that is an avenue I'm unfortunately not going to be exploring all the way today, because that is indeed a large undertaking. I'm going to be focusing more on this obscure other version, the Bayan al-Jawhar an-Nafis, and less on the standard version, and trying to situate that within the mature works of Avicenna. So my new proposal is that these are not different recensions by Ibn Sina, not a young Ibn Sina or an old Ibn Sina, but actually two different documents by two different authors. So on the one hand, we have the treatise by Ibn Sina, Sir Ajram al-Ulwiya. This is the standard version in the Tis'a Rasail. And the other text, the Bayan al-Jawhar an-Nafis, is actually a very late Ottoman epitome of the work, with comments and glosses. And of course, it's unmarked in the manuscript, in the print, but my proposal basically revolves around the notion that it's Jamal ad-Din al-Qāsimī, the reformer and scholar writing in Damascus in the end of the Ottoman period, who was responsible for the content and style and everything of that text. So what are the evidence that I'm going to be bringing to the table today? Well, there's two basic kinds of the evidence. One is internal, looking at the Bayan itself, looking at the language of the document, noting its divergences and various ways in which it departs from the standard version. I'm also going to look externally to all that, zooming out a little bit, looking at the historical developments of the time, the kind of social and educational reform movements that are taking place, and focusing in on Jamal ad-Din himself and his role in all of this, and his networks of scholars, and how this book came into existence. So to start, this is now the collected letters, the Rasail, that basically contains the Bayan al-Jawhar an-Nafis. It was a huge work published in 1910 by the Kurdistan Press in Cairo, and with the financial backing of the publisher Muhyiddin Sabri al-Kurdi. And I do want to mention that in all of this subsequent investigation, I'm drawing heavily on the work by Ahmed al-Shamsi, who recently published on sort of this print revolution and the shift from the manuscript period to the printed book tradition. It was reading through that work that I first sort of became keyed into this publisher and their modus operandi. So between 1907 and 1911, this short-lived career of this press, basically, the publisher Muhyiddin Sabri al-Kurdi and the co-owner Farajallah Zaki, also Kurdish, published a number of works, including those by Ibn Qutayba, Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, and others. And the general approach to their publication seems to have been to circumvent late Ottoman scholastic authorities, basically trying to revitalize these early neglected texts which weren't really being used anymore, educationally or otherwise. They weren't in print, they weren't really well known. And at the time, Cairo is comparably free from Ottoman pressure. They don't have to worry so much as they would if they were publishing in, say, Damascus or Istanbul. So more on the collected set of letters here, this Majmu'ah. It's massive, first of all. It's 636 pages, and there are about 23 works in it. I haven't been able to inspect all these works. Funny story, this is the reason some of these photographs are kind of funny and blurry and in German, is that I first started getting into this book when I was in Germany in the Staatsbibliothek, and I was just browsing through the shelves one day, and I came across this Majmu'ah. I thought, ooh, this might be really interesting. I saw that there was, some treatises in here and a few others. Frantically with my early 2000 cell phone, started taking pictures of all the pages I could, because they charge you like 8 cents a page to photocopy things like that. So that's why we have poor image quality here. But I didn't take pictures of all 636 pages. I took pictures of the Avicenna treatise and the index. Yeah. Someday I will have to go back through and find a copy of this book. It's not commonly found in libraries. I don't think it's in the Yale library. I've done a lot of digging and I haven't been able to find it. I think it's only really in a few libraries.
Princeton must have it.
Princeton must. If Ahmed is working on it, it must be Princeton. So this is the story behind the Majmua, is where things get really interesting. The texts that make up the volume, all 23 in the recital, seem to have been collected, copied out by hand from manuscripts, and sent to Cairo by Jamal ad-Din al-Qāsimī. We know this because of letters between him and his intermediary, his contact, his point man in Cairo, Tahir al-Jazairi. And Tahir was also sort of a controversial reformist. He had to flee to Cairo from Damascus in 1906, a few years before all this went down. And the letter we have here mentions, this is now from Tahir to Jamal back in Damascus. I was pleased with the collection of text, the Majmu'ah al-Mutun, that you arranged, as was our friend Amin, this is Amin Afenji, another publisher in Cairo. It is hoped that it will be published soon, this Majmu'ah will be published, and that it will be followed regularly by more treatises of comparable benefit. We can talk about what kind of benefit later, but so there's the evidence that we have for this collection. And this was a year, or actually a few months before it came out in print. This is November 1909. Now we're turning a little more in depth to the internal evidence. This is where the case really rests. So the Bayan al-Jawhar al-Nafis just appears to be a treatise by Ibn Sina. We have Li, the Sheikh Rais, Ibn Sina, and there's no mention of anything else. No mention of Jamal ad-Din anywhere. There's no mention of any manuscripts used or any editorial practices. I have a feeling that being anonymous in all this might have been strategic if you're trying to avoid any kind of repercussions from the authorities. Not putting your name on a big book or even on a small treatise within a big book might have been beneficial. The Risal itself, the text, launches straight in, Qala al-Sheikh Rais. So one would think, reading along, that it was the Sheikh Rais' own words here, Ibn Sina. Incidentally, these are the same three words, Qala Sheikh Rais, with which the other version begins. Those are the end of the similarities. After that, it becomes a different text, but they begin the same way. It isn't as though Qala Sheikh Rais indicates that he's holding the Sheikh. This is a standard way of introducing it. There's occasional punctuation, but not of the kind that is a help to anybody. We see random stars and brackets and things like that just sort of thrown willy-nilly into the text. We see all these ornamental parentheses around words that are usually either ordinal, like the first or the second, and things like that. And certain key terms like theology here, the philologia, and also around Qala Sheikh every now and then, but not always, and around the fusul, every section. It seems as though these are either at the discretion of the printers, or maybe they were trying their best to mark out things that had been rubricated or underlined or overlined in whatever source text they were working from. The printers, of course, would be reading a manuscript and setting the type. In terms of style and language, the Bayan has all kinds of modern terms and phrases. I mean, reading along, you're struck by expressions like haythiyat, which I believe comes up in very late jurisprudential discussions about qualifying considerations and stuff like that. We don't really see those kind of terms in early medieval philosophy. The expression that really struck me was in a later passage where he's talking about bringing the student face to face with the truth of the matter. He says, which I don't think I've ever come across in an old text. But other things like rububiyat and ilm-al-lahut, things like that, which, sure, maybe you'll find a medieval text here and there that mentions these things, but they're definitely not the standard terms that you see. Same with falsafa al-kulliyya, which we'll see later. It's not the usual ilm al-kulli that we see in some of the discussions of the old period. Occasionally you run across a passage that just doesn't make any sense. Now, for many of you, none of these passages make any sense, but this one, for even those trained in this Aristotelian sort of language of natural philosophy, al-jism al-mutlaq min haythu huwa mutlaq doesn't really amount to the hill of beans. I mean, it should say al-jism al-mutlaq min haythu huwa jism, or something like that. The body in itself, insofar as it's a body, not the body in itself, insofar as it's in itself or something like that. More subtle, but also important to note, there are some strange passages that don't quite combine right when you're reading through them. There's breaks in the syntax. You look at the standard version, for example. He says, each of the particular sciences has principles that are accepted and built upon by the practitioner of that science, the sahib. Insofar as he's a practitioner of that science, he has no discourse with someone who denies or opposes these principles. That's perfectly clear. In the Bayan, we read, each of the particular sciences adopts principles and premises from another science without confirming them by means of demonstration. For this reason, and then insofar as he, this he is the problem here. We have a lam yakun lahu without a referent to which that who would go. It's not the ilm that has any kind of discourse with the other practitioners. So basically what happened was, my theory, in this epitomizing process, some of the syntax got jumbled up, and we have these pronouns that no longer refer back to the thing that had been epitomized out. That's all rather technical, but we're going to get to something a little more meaningful soon. I'll find which slide I'm on here now. I think we've moved past that all. Yeah, too far ahead. There we go. So basically, the discrepancies are not as simple and straightforward as Gutas has pointed out in his idea that there's an elaborate and straightforward version. I think as you work your way through the treatise, as the evidence accumulates, you see that none of those adjectives really fit for the whole document. In many cases, we'll see that the more elaborate version is actually much shorter than the relevant passage in the Bayan. And also there's less precision usually in the Bayan than there is in the standard version. And one example of the loss of precision, we have the simple bodies and early primordial body are composed in another sense. That is to say, according to them, they're composed of matter, hayula, and something that brings this other substance, matter, into being, or into actuality, and it's called form. So that very technical term there, the wamin mutammim lihada al-jawhar, so the thing that brings this substance into completeness, basically, into actuality. We don't see that in the Bayan. They say in the Bayan version, this simple body is simple only in this respect and to this extent. To be precise, it is composed of two different things, one called in the language of the ancients hayula, the other form. So there's some loss. There's some less technical expressions. Elsewhere, though, in the standard version, we see a very straightforward and direct claim. Present investigation, according to the ancients, is part of the natural science. Whereas in the Bayan, we see there's a long, kind of Baroque, elaborate, complex digression where he says the previous investigation, which clarified the fundamental principles of the body only insofar as its body constitutes some of the principles of the art, and he uses a different word, we call natural. Or we could say that investigation belongs to the art, for, he says, each technical art he has three things: the principles, the questions, and the subjects. So, to me, that smacks of a kind of educational gloss. He's sort of filling out the picture for his students. He takes a very simple, straightforward claim, and he sort of ruminates upon it and gives a more elaborate version. Now, in the midst of the first section of this work, the two versions suddenly diverge in a way that's much more dramatic than I've seen. The Bayan has a 140-word digression, basically clarifying this notion of prime matter that had been introduced before, and it doesn't correspond to anything that we see in the standard version. I have the text a little larger for those people trying to make their screens bigger at home. Basically, you can see how these come apart. And even in the first section already, there's some major differences in the content, but I'll just read the Bayan down the line here so we can have the experience of reading that. So this first thing, this primordial body, is not some, prime matter rather, is not some distinct thing in actuality, separated in imagination and according to sensation, but is in fact a suitability belonging to one of the principles of being, so istidad. They likened this. Here we're not really tracking anything in the standard version. They liken this hayula, prime matter, to clay that is suited to transform into various things, such as a pitcher or a jar or the like, or to wood that is suited to transform into various things like that, such as a bed or a chair or a door, or similar products of craft, or to dough in a similar way. even though these examples convey and correspond to the exemplar, which means prime matter. In a sense, they may give an impression contrary to what has been intended, and thus it is very important to qualify this analogy in multiple respects. This is the hythiat, which I don't think I've ever seen in another text. Accordingly, one says this prime matter is, like clay, disposed to transform only with respect to its disposition, and not with respect to having any individual reality, such as clayness. Similarly, in the case of dough and wood. And if we wanted to remove the veil from the face of truth and bring truth face to face with the student, we would say that Taula is like animalness, insofar as it is animalness, isolated from whatever it is that causes a certain species to come about in actuality and reality. It is the thing from which the genus is produced. None of this has any corresponding source in the standard version of Avicenna. Now, when the texts mysteriously converge again, we see one more time this Qal al-Sheikh, which, remember, were also the words that introduced the text, but here it's quite clear that it marks out a resumption of the epitome proper and the end of this big, long digression. And coincidentally, we see in the standard version, once again, these texts sort of match up. In the beginning, however, when this digression gains momentum, there's nothing to mark out a digression of any kind in the text, in the printed text we're looking at. There is a star, but there's a star all over the place. It's sometimes at the end of a paragraph. And we see it here, but again, it's not clear reading along. This is suddenly not something that the Sheikh al-Ra'is said is it. There's another passage on atoms, and this historical account that Avicenna is giving of atomism, and how this idea had been processed by the ancients. And in the Bayan, we see a rather sharp critique here. Perhaps Avicenna means the Democritean bodies. If not, and he starts going on a long tangent here, then, Kalam is full of atoms. Everyone's talking about atoms, and he has some things to say about all the reasons that they started thinking about atoms, but it's for another discussion. Basically, he seems to be democracy, yeah. Which, again, is one of these terms which you would never find in a medieval text. Let's see if we can get to the next slide here. I keep jumping ahead because every time I touch the PowerPoint, I lose my cursor. All right. Ibn Sina, though, the critique may be justified because, of course, the view of atomism did not disappear from the pages of the history of thinking. Of course, by the time Avicenna is writing, it's really in its heyday. But Ibn Sina is not talking about Kalam. He's talking about the Hustle, this sort of established opinion that had sort of taken shape among the Falasifa. It's goes without saying. That's why it doesn't really make sense to the later commentary. He's talking about the decline and eventual decease of atomism, as though it sort of petered out and nobody ever dealt with it again. It became the scholarly consensus, the ijma', that atoms could now weigh and act be the principles of bodies. Now, in the next fossil, this is all in really the beginning of the text. We're in first two of, I think, 5, maybe 6 fusul. And here things get a little more interesting, and this is where some of the most striking evidence for a dialogue in this text comes to face. We're talking about the ways in which various sciences fit together at this point. And Ibn Sina in the Ajram al-Ulawiyya says that, in fact, the principles of all sciences are covered by 2 arts, either by way of demonstration, so that they're covered in first philosophy, metaphysics, also called divine science, or by way of persuasion, such that they're covered by dialectic. Kind of a dense claim if you're not really keyed into these kinds of discussions, but we see in the Bayan al-Jawhar al-Nafis this much more complicated discussion with many more names for these sciences with the same basic idea. So all these funun are taken absolutely under the guarantee basically of 2 different arts, either demonstrative, called the highest science, first philosophy, divine science, what is beyond nature, probably mabada tabi'a in metaphysics. What is after nature, what is before nature, according to the various expressions. He says,
yeah, you must have.
الاختلاف
That is reading because
الاعتبارات.
ما قبلها, that's Avicenna does use that in the Darn Ismail.
No.
He calls it before.
Well, he certainly read his Avicenna.
Yeah, so he's
I imagine that's where he's getting that from.
Yeah.
Part of this art is called theology, ufologia, that is to say divinity. He's glossing these terms, and the principles of being, abade of wujud. The other, he says, is dialectical. That is to say, it establishes its questions by means of dialectical reasoning. Just a side note, in yellow, this whole talk about first philosophy, metaphysics on the one hand, and dialectic also somehow guaranteeing the discussion of all other arts, it's coming out of Philoponus in his commentary on physics, which was enormously influential in the medieval Arabic world, and it's quite certain that Avicenna was reading this commentary. Basically, Philoponus was probably not the first, but the most important person to point out that Aristotle, when he says in the topics that the aim of the subject of the topics is to find a method whereby we may be able to reason logically about everything that is presented by a set of opinions. It seems as though that's in tension with claims Aristotle makes elsewhere that the first philosophy, metaphysics, is the only science that really is the science of all things. So if you have metaphysics on the one hand and dialectic on the other, both competing to have the ability to discuss everything, that's where this is all coming from. Anyway. That's why we see it in this treatise, and also in this epitome. Here is where we start to see a little more interesting evidence. For the first time in one of the treatises of Bayan, we see Okulu, I say. And this is in response to something that appears in both versions, but basically Ibn Sina is trying to compare kalam and dialectic and saying that they seem to be basically the same kind of thing. But kalam in our day maybe only falls slightly short of dialectic. The epitomizer, Jamaluddin, says this hope is just this hope that dialectic and kalam are basically the same kind of thing. For the fundamental principles, I think I've got a bigger version of this. Sorry. The fundamental principles, the usul, and aims of this art, of the art of kalam, are accepted from the prophets and the plenipotentiaries, the anbiya or awsiya, accompanied by guidance towards dialectical arguments that bring about belief in those fundamental principles. But if the fundamental principles are adopted separate or without those intellectual dialectical arguments, and rather taken solely with arguments based on the authority of transmission, it would be better to call this art rhetorical. We'll say more about that later. Yeah. But the point I want to make here is that for the first time in the text, we have this okul, and of course nothing corresponding to whatever comes next in the original version. And he goes on. This is more of the epitome here. At this point, Hadith Kalam does not apply solely to this art that investigates Arabic and Islamic beliefs. Rather, it applies to any art that investigates beliefs obtained from any prophet, insofar as they are obtained from that prophet and not derived from pure intellection. One of these arts is the one the Christians call ilm al-lahut. He's taking this claim, his minor claim, basically assimilating kalam and dialectic, and saying yes, and here are all the ways in which kalam may fall short, namely if it doesn't employ any rational arguments, if it just relies on the authority of transmission. And then he broadens the claim to say yes, and it's not just Islamic kalam we're talking about, it's also Christian theology. Now, I'm not going to work through all the rest of the text because there's a whole bunch of different problems that emerge. Suddenly, in the third fasl and in subsequent fasl, we see footnotes. There were no footnotes at any point in the first two fasl, but all of a sudden, here they are. And there's also various kinds of signposting going on and sort of thematic markers that mark out what the text is about. We also see these unmarked digressions, like the ones we've seen before, continue throughout the text. And, of course, the same epitomizing style, the same approach to the text. Even when they're saying the same thing, they're not saying it in the same words. So how could there be so many different kinds of discrepancies between these two versions? The Bayan is all the same time an epitome with notes that are, Kobayashi sort of short notes, and also these longer critical interjections and explanatory comments. My theory is that in the handwritten text that al-Qāsimī was said to have compiled and sent to the printers, it may have looked a lot like this. This is not our text here, the Bayan, but it is another text in the hand of al-Qāsimī. This was printed in a book by his son, who wrote a nice biography of his dad.
Oh.
And basically brought together an awful lot of his primary work and documents. He had the access to it. And here we see basically, this is called a musawwada, the blackened copy of a text where you've sort of marked it all up and added things here and there and taken things out. So if you were to hand something like that to a printer, assuredly there would be confusion. There would be an inability to differentiate a remark, a comment, a critique from the main body of the text, especially since sometimes, a mistake like, oops, I forgot a word, can look an awful lot like a gloss, or a longer comment can look an awful lot like, oops, I forgot a section. So this would explain all these digressions, critiques, and everything that sort of blended right in without any marking to the mutton in the print. So that's a sort of material account of how this could happen. We know that in other works by al-Qāsimī, printed in other presses, there's a bit more regularity with the kinds of comments and the kinds of notes that we see. So this is a nice printing of his edition and commentary, the Sharh of Zarkashi's Luqtat al-Ajlan, printed in 1908, 2 years earlier, at a different press, all in Cairo though. And you see the text on top in large print, and his commentary, his Sharh, beneath in little print. And later on in the same thing, as the text goes on, we see these nice footnotes all of a sudden. We see number 1 here and number 1 here, and then he sort of explains what's meant by this hish and mishtarak, and he gives a nice detailed note there. So maybe his exemplar, his Musawwada looked better. Maybe the printers were more adept at putting a rough copy and handwriting into a book. Who knows how it happened, but in some books we see a nice, neat, and orderly system. There's another explanation that needs to be taken into account, and it revolves around the style of the work itself. I mean, not just the fact that we have all these intrusions and bizarre digressions, but this sort of epitomized form of the text as a whole. And this sort of speaks to the aim that Jamal ad-Din might have had when he put this thing together. He wants to make the general message of the work accessible to readers who may not command the kind of Arabic that you need to read Avicenna, which is admittedly not everybody's favorite kind of Arabic. So his sympathies may have been more towards the trend of epitomizing than towards the sake of fidelity to the text. It would not have bothered him at all to completely transform the language of the source, as long as he was, the whole point, it seems to have been behind writing this majmu'ah, this compiled volume of all these risales, seems to have been so that students could read them on their own without a sheikh. We see the same epitomizing style in al-Qāsimī's other publications. Especially, he has this mukhtasar of Ghazali's Ihya al-Ulumuddin, which came out a few years earlier, and he mentions in his prologue of this thing that it's a deliberate choice of his, and it's to specifically modify the text so that it could be used by students. He had been hearing complaints that students couldn't approach this text because it was too dense and too rich. We still have another question. Why on earth would Jamal ad-Din go through the hassle of epitomizing and commenting and digressing on this particular text in the first place? An early medieval appraisal of ancient Greek views on heavenly bodies and atoms and prime matter is not in any way obvious as a candidate for publication in Cairo in 1910. It's not a real compelling modern concern in the age of the telegraph to wonder whether or not there are atoms and whether or not the heavenly bodies are such and such, and whether the influence of Mars is different than the influence of Saturn on them. Well, certainly some people may have still wanted to know about that, but I think there are more compelling reasons for publishing this text that have to do with its more meta-scientific material. Just as a side note, this is a couple of pages from al-Qāsimī's Irshad al-Khalq ila al-Amal bi Khabar al-Barak. So he wrote a treatise basically explaining why it's legally permissible to use the telegraph. Apparently people had asked him to compile the various fatwas on the issue. I think that reading the Bayan of Jawhar al-Nafis, and of course its source, the Ajram al-Ulwi's treatise on heavenly bodies, as a work primarily concerned with the scientific method on usul, it starts to make a little more sense why al-Qāsimī would have wanted to include this text in his majmu'ah. it is full of very interesting historical observations by Avicenna about the scholarly consensus building, for example, around atomism. And in particular, I think it's important because of how it delineates boundaries in a very clear and relatable way between various modes of scientific inquiry, metaphysics on the one hand versus natural philosophy on the other, dialectic versus demonstrative arguments, the idea of transmission from authority based on the exercise of pure reason. So these are themes that were very near and very dear to al-Qāsimī's heart. And I think that explains why he spends so much time, especially on the point likening kalam and dialectic. Just as a side note, there's a nice little blip from his son's biography where, I put it down so I wouldn't forget it. In one of his other works is sort of another compilation that he made earlier in life. His son, notes that he picked a lot of obscure works, and nobody really knows why he picked these works. But he says, as the old saying goes, "Ikhtiyar al-mar' khatim min aqlihi." So, a person's choices are a shard of his intellect. It takes a certain kind of mind to choose a certain kind of work, including an emotional. Anyway, at the heart of this treatise on heavenly bodies, which is also, of course, concerned with the physics of these heavenly bodies, there's this debate about what kinds of starting points you have in science, what kinds of questions you can ask with those starting points, and who can do the asking. And this is going to be very relevant for the debates that were raging at this time in late Ottoman Syria and Egypt over the role and legitimacy of ijtihad in the Islamic sciences, jurisprudence and fiqh, and also in Quran. Basically, the question boils down to who has the authority to read these things and say things about them. Turning to a formative period in al-Qāsimī's career, we have the so-called Mujtahid's incident. Now, this has been recently explored and translated by Peter Poppins, but just drawing some telling remarks from this whole incident. More or less, al-Qāsimī and his friends were in a reading group and got into a little hot water with the Mufti in Damascus. Apparently, just because they were reading and he was writing a gloss as he read on the Kashf al-Ghumma, this work of hadith by an earlier writer, Shahrani, in the 16th century. There's a long, drawn-out account of how this all transpired, but basically the gist of it was that some people thought that he was not able to do this. He should not have been allowed to read this book and write his own gloss. And when push comes to shove, they even said that some people accuse you of, creating your own personal madhab, your own personal school of thinking. He laughs at the fact that people started talking about a Jamali madhab. But this comment, which is by the Mufti here, why would you even read hadith? You should stick to works of fiqh. You should stick to works of things that you're trained in. You shouldn't be reading hadith and tafsir and all that. It's basically a real overstep, it seemed to some people, to exercise one's mind on texts that are part of a superior science when you're really only meant to be working on these lower sciences. A very similar theme that we came up against in Adram. Qāsimī has some nice little remarks, and he apparently quite a poet. He wrote a poem basically protesting the decline of intellect in his time. He says it's a time in which all knowledge is denied, or what you see as the banner of knowledge is hung at half-mast. And the clothing of ignorance is worn from the sandal to the turban. It was he had quite a turn of a phrase there. One of my favorite quotes, it says, "The acumen of men is, I think, and his freedom of thought become a blameworthy thing." This is all coming from his own account of the incident. Basically, this incident, which 14 years before we're talking here in the publication of this treatise on heavenly bodies, we see a flashpoint in the conflict between taqlid, this imitative authority on one hand, and ijtihad, the personal, grappling, rational inquiry with these texts. It mobilized a segment of the literary population in Damascus at the time, in opposition to this sort of oppressive Ottoman political and religious authority that wanted to control which books were read and by whom. And I think this was a formative experience for him, of course, and it must have motivated him to continue his work collecting, compiling, and eventually publishing these texts, which some people have told me he wasn't even allowed to read. And in later years, we don't often hear of al-Qāsimī as a great political figure or anything like that, but he did spark a lot of reform, and his main method of doing that was to publish and to reform through education. It was often dangerous to be a political reformer at the time, and even dangerous apparently to be a kind of reformer like al-Qāsimī. He invited the publisher Rashid Rida to speak in Damascus right after the Young Turk Revolution. And during his khutbah, I think Rashid Rida was stormed off the stage by a rowdy group of ulama who wanted to accuse him of being a Wahhabi extremist. Rida flees back to Egypt, and Jamal ad-Din basically has to hide in his house writing poetry for 3 months, and that's where some of those poems come from. But he never stops gathering his manuscripts, and he has, at this point, quite a network of people helping him in that regard. And he's writing his own books at the same time. We have his correspondence with the reformist Mahmoud Shakri al-Alusi, based in Baghdad. And it's sort of with his help that he's, at the same time, 1908 to 1911, compiling his massive 5-volume publication, basically of Ibn Taymiyyah's writings. He's one of the 2 people mostly responsible for reviving the study of Ibn Taymiyyah. And I just thought this was interesting. Right about the same time that the Ajram al-Ulwi, this Bayan complex of text, the epitome comes out, and right around the same time, al-Qāsimī finishes a major work on the history of the idea of jinn in the various sayings of the pre-Islamic Arabs all the way up. He cites Jahiz quite a lot, and Muhammad Abduh up to the end. I mean, he's got a rich sort of portfolio of all the things that have been said, thought about the idea of jinn and the related concept of spirits and demonology and that sort of thing. It's a work that struck me as rather similar, although different in many respects, to the same kind of historicizing view of intellectual history that Ibn Sina was trying to do. Of course, that's a totally different topic, and there's different methods and purposes to write such a book, but I just thought that was interesting. So, to conclude, we have 2 very different documents. And the standard version, I think, it has not been tested against the high criteria of comparing to all of his mature works and Shafa and others, but I don't get the sense that there's anything extremely controversial in Ibn Sina's early treatise on the heavenly body. I think it's probably true that it has a lot of similarities to some of the works of his teacher, and it may show a sort of less technical approach to the heavenly body. It's more like a sort of college-age paper than any kind of mature publication. But that's a subject for another discussion. And then we have the Bayan al-Jawhar al-Nafis, which I think the proof and evidence is there that this is actually a very late epitome by Jamal ad-Din, and full of glosses and side remarks and tangents throughout. I think al-Qāsimī chose this work to meet a very real social and scholarly need, and that need was not to understand ancient views on even more ancient theories of the cosmos, and it was not to establish a true and philologically faithful text or edition of Avicenna. Keep in mind, 2 years earlier we had text of Avicenna printed in Cairo. Whether he knew about that or not is anybody's guess, probably didn't. But I think he chose this work to legitimize a certain approach to science, to try and hold up the banner of intellect a little higher, to say that yes, we can engage rationally with intellectual discussions about the principles of sciences. And the publishers in the end of the Majmu' al-Rasail mentioned that these works have been put together to sort of serve as a benefit to the reader. And the benefit, of course, has a kind of just pure erudition to it. I mean, you could benefit just by learning things, but I think the kind of benefit they were after was the kind of benefit that encouraged students to engage with texts on their own, to become more like the scholars whose works they were reading. So to just stretch the analogy a little further here, back in the early 11th century out in Gurganj, Ibn Sina is grappling with all the primary sources he can get his hands on, of course in Arabic, struggling with very difficult translationese of these texts, trying to form a view of a millennium of natural philosophy from the pre-Socratics all the way up to the Alexandrian commentators. Fast forward about 800, 900 years, Jamal ad-Din in Damascus is seeking out all the manuscripts he can get his hands on, often manuscripts written in an obscure kind of Arabic that has changed in many ways for hundreds of years, working through all of the intellectual achievement that went into them and reaching back to as many primary documents as he can. Now, both scholars sought to better understand the roots of perennial problems and tensions in the history of ideas between innovation on the one hand, verification on the other hand, if we had a third hand, this idea of authority and tradition. So I think these two men had a very similar scholarly impulse. Now, that's not to say that al-Qāsimī was a good Avicenna scholar. I think there are ways in which he could have been more faithful to the text. But I think that those two had very similar minds when it came to the idea of finding universally applicable in ancient wisdom, even though these texts ended up very different. That's all I have to say. I'm looking very much forward to your comments and questions, and thank you for your time.